Washington, D.C., early 1962. The room is well lit, orderly, and confident in its own logic. Long tables, stacked briefing folders, coffee cooling untouched beside ashtrays. On the walls, Southeast Asia appears as a collection of borders drawn with more certainty than the people who live within them. Men in suits speak in measured tones. Across agencies, the Pentagon, the CIA, the State Department, a shared conclusion has settled in quietly, almost comfortably. North Vietnam cannot win, not outright. Not against American power, not in any sustained, decisive way. The intelligence estimates agree. The charts align. Industrial capacity, logistics, manpower, air power, every metric points in the same direction. The enemy can harass, disrupt, bleed, but not prevail. This assessment is not shouted. It doesn't need to be. It is repeated. And repetition gives it authority. The confidence hardens as it moves. Early field reports describe an enemy that retreats under pressure. Bombing campaigns show impressive sortie numbers. Body counts rise. Supply lines appear fragile. Hanoi's infrastructure looks vulnerable. Each new data point reinforces the existing conclusion instead of challenging it. Contradictions are not denied, they are explained away. A failed operation becomes a local mistake. A resilient enemy unit becomes an exception. A political setback becomes irrelevant to the military balance. The intelligence language remains calm, analytical, restrained. We assess. It is unlikely that there is no indication that these phrases create distance between analysis and doubt. Inside the system, caution exists, but it is selective. It is cautious about escalation, cautious about overreaction, cautious about dramatic reinterpretation. What it is not cautious about is the estimate itself. The conclusion slips into planning. If the enemy cannot win, then time favors the United States. Pressure, applied steadily, will force concessions. Attrition will work. Resolve will break resistance. This belief shapes everything that follows. Troop levels are debated not as a question of whether victory is possible, but how long it will take. Political risk is calculated under the assumption that the end point is fixed. Victory is no longer a hypothesis. It is an expectation. No one writes this sentence explicitly. They don't need to, because everyone is already operating as if it were true. And when an assumption becomes invisible, it becomes dangerous. The war has not yet revealed itself, but the framework through which it will be understood is already locked in place. Saigon, late 1964. Ceiling fans turn slowly in headquarters rooms built for colonial administrators, not modern war managers. Maps of South Vietnam hang beside charts tracking sorties, hamlets secured, enemy casualties reported. The numbers are neat, reassuring. American advisors move between briefings with clipboards and quiet confidence. The language has standardized itself. Progress, stability, momentum. The intelligence estimate still holds. North Vietnam cannot sustain this. The war, it is believed, is moving in the correct direction, just not fast enough to feel decisive. The first fractures do not arrive as dramatic reversals. They arrive as discomfort. Reports from the countryside describe something inconsistent with attrition models. Enemy units withdraw, then return. Villages cleared reappear contested weeks later. Roads secured by day become dangerous by night. Body counts increase, yet control does not. Analysts notice the mismatch but struggle to categorize it. The metrics are being met. The enemy is losing men at a rate no industrialized military should endure. Logistics estimates insist Hanoi cannot replace these losses indefinitely. So the conclusion remains unchanged. The problem must be implementation. Commanders debate tactics. not premises. Air campaigns are refined. Search and destroy operations are expanded. Advisory roles become combat roles. Incrementally, carefully, rationally. Each adjustment assumes the original estimate is sound. Inside Washington, dissent exists, but it is procedural, not foundational. Some analysts suggest the enemy's tolerance for loss may be higher than expected. Others note political factors that cannot be bombed or counted. These concerns are acknowledged, then filed. They do not overturn the central belief: capacity determines outcome, and capacity, on paper, still favors the United States. 1965. The decision to escalate is framed not as a gamble, but as inevitability. If the enemy cannot win, then additional force will accelerate resolution. Delay only prolongs exposure. Gradual escalation feels prudent, controlled, reversible. Rolling thunder begins. Sorties multiply, targets expand. Tons of ordnance fall with mathematical regularity. Damage assessments arrive on schedule, confirming infrastructure destruction, transportation disruption, measurable pressure. But something unexpected happens. The enemy adapts. Supply routes reroute. Units disperse. Command decentralizes. The war becomes less legible, not more. This creates anxiety inside intelligence circles, but not enough to trigger reassessment. Instead, the adaptation is interpreted as desperation, proof that pressure is working. If Hanoi were confident, it would behave conventionally. The fact that it doesn't is taken as validation. The shock does not arrive as a single event. It arrives as accumulation. Despite sustained bombing, North Vietnamese units continue operating in the south. Despite rising casualties, recruitment does not collapse. Despite pressure, negotiations stall without concession. Then come moments that do not fit the script at all. Large-scale coordinated attacks, sophisticated logistics networks, command and control resilience that defies earlier estimates. Each time, intelligence updates are issued. Each time, the core conclusion survives intact. The enemy is strong, but not strong enough. Persistent, but unsustainable. Capable, but ultimately doomed. Every contradiction is treated as temporary. No one wants to be the analyst who declares that the foundational estimate might be wrong, because that would imply something far worse than miscalculation. It would imply that the war itself has been misunderstood. By the mid-1960s, the system is under strain. Field commanders ask for more troops, not to win decisively, but to hold ground already secured. Intelligence officers privately express concern that the enemy's political cohesion has been underestimated. Diplomats warn that time is no longer neutral, but institutionally, nothing breaks. The estimate still governs. North Vietnam cannot win, which means every setback must be survivable. Every escalation must be justified. Every warning must be weighed against the danger of overreaction. The intelligence community does not collapse under pressure. It narrows. It becomes more careful with language, more defensive of prior assessments, more reluctant to admit that reality is diverging faster than analysis can follow. The war is no longer being shaped by intelligence. Intelligence is now being shaped by the war it was meant to explain. And somewhere inside that inversion, the path to reversal quietly disappears. Washington, D.C., early 1967. The war is no longer abstract, but it is still manageable, on paper. Inside the Pentagon, senior officials review intelligence summaries that have grown thicker, more cautious, more carefully worded. The language has shifted over time. Certainty has softened into probability. Probability into confidence with caveats. But the conclusion at the top remains unchanged. North Vietnam cannot sustain this indefinitely. What has changed is the scale of commitment required to make that prediction come true. More troops are deployed, not because the enemy is winning, but because victory is taking longer than forecast. More bombs are dropped, not because strategy has failed, but because success requires persistence. Every escalation is framed as the final adjustment, the last push, the necessary pressure, the step that makes the numbers align again. The war has become an exercise in patience, measured in lives. Inside intelligence circles, something dangerous happens. The estimate hardens. What began as an assessment becomes an assumption. What was once debated becomes embedded in planning documents, briefing slides, and policy memos. New analysts inherit the conclusion before they inherit the evidence. When contradictory reports arrive, they are filtered through that inheritance. Enemy morale remains high. Temporary resilience. Logistics remain intact. External support distortion. Major coordinated attacks appear. A final gamble before collapse. Every anomaly is explained without challenging the core belief. Not because analysts are incompetent, but because the system rewards consistency over disruption. To overturn the estimate now would not merely revise strategy. It would indict years of decisions, hundreds of thousands of deployments, entire air campaigns, diplomatic postures sold to allies and the public. Admitting error is no longer an analytical act, it is a political one. Then the decision arrives, not as a declaration, but as confirmation. Despite warnings from some quarters, despite evidence that the enemy's capacity has been underestimated, the United States commits fully to the attrition model. Victory will be achieved by outlasting the enemy, not by negotiation, not by withdrawal, not by redefining objectives, by endurance. This decision is irreversible because it locks policy, intelligence, and credibility together. If North Vietnam can endure longer than expected, then the war cannot simply be adjusted. It must be explained. And explanations come after events, not before them. From this moment on, intelligence no longer has permission to ask the most dangerous question: what if they can win? The shock arrives in 1968. Not quietly, not gradually. The Tet Offensive explodes across South Vietnam with coordination, scale, and audacity that contradicts every assurance of imminent enemy exhaustion. Cities thought secure are attacked. Command centers are breached. The psychological balance shatters overnight. Militarily, the offensive is costly for North Vietnam. Strategically, it is devastating for the estimate. The enemy has not collapsed. It has demonstrated capacity, not just to survive but to choose timing, scale, and political impact. For the first time, the question is unavoidable. If they were never close to collapse, then what has the war been achieving? In the weeks after Tet, intelligence assessments are rewritten, carefully, cautiously, defensively. Language changes, but conclusions lag behind reality. Officials debate interpretation rather than implication. Some argue Tet proves enemy desperation. Others sense something more fundamental, but struggle to articulate it without detonating institutional trust. The public, however, understands immediately. What was promised as nearing conclusion now looks endless. The intelligence estimate has not just failed to predict events. It has shaped a strategy that made reversal impossible without admitting that the war was never winnable on its own terms. From here forward, the conflict cannot be won as planned. It can only be managed, explained, or escaped. And none of those options come without cost. Washington, D.C., late 1968. The rooms are quieter now. Briefings are shorter. Slides contain fewer arrows, more footnotes. The confident language that once framed the war as a solvable equation has thinned into conditional phrasing. Progress continues, but enemy losses are significant, however. Political conditions complicate. No one speaks of victory timelines anymore. The war has not been lost, but it no longer behaves like a war that can be won. That distinction matters, because institutions are built to pursue success, not to acknowledge stalemate. Inside the intelligence and policy apparatus, a slow fracture sets in. The original estimate that the enemy could not sustain the fight has collapsed under events, but replacing it creates a vacuum no one wants to fill. If North Vietnam can endure indefinitely, then attrition is not strategy, it is delay. If delay is all that remains, then every additional deployment, every bombing run, every escalation must be justified not by outcome, but by avoidance. Avoiding collapse, avoiding humiliation, avoiding the admission that the foundation was wrong. New assessments are produced, but they hedge, they soften, they disperse responsibility across variables, allies, politics, media, public opinion. The enemy's capacity is no longer underestimated. It is no longer clearly understood at all, and uncertainty, at this scale, is paralyzing. The real shock does not come from the battlefield. It comes from realization. Inside closed meetings, officials confront a truth that cannot be made public without consequence. The war is no longer governed by military feasibility. It is governed by credibility. Ending it risks admitting misjudgment. Continuing it risks proving that misjudgment every day. The intelligence estimate that once justified confidence now traps decision-makers in place. If the enemy cannot be defeated decisively, then withdrawal becomes a political failure rather than a strategic adjustment. Every path forward is loss, differing only in how visible it is. This is how collapse occurs in modern war. Not through surrender. Through exhaustion of acceptable choices, policy shifts begin, but they are disguised. Vietnamization. Negotiations framed as leverage. Reductions described as transitions. The language avoids the central admission that the original estimate shaped a war that could not end on its own terms. The intelligence community recalibrates, but quietly. Reports emphasize complexity. Uncertainty becomes institutionalized, not as warning, but as cover. The system does not break. It adapts to manage decline, and in doing so, it confirms the most uncomfortable consequence of all. The war was not prolonged because leaders didn't know the truth. It was prolonged because they knew it too late and had already built a strategy that could not survive being wrong. Washington, D.C., early 1973. The war does not end with an announcement. It ends with paperwork, cables confirming withdrawals, memos noting compliance, briefings focused on process, not outcome. The last American combat units leave Vietnam not in defeat formations, not under fire, but quietly, administratively, as if closing a long-running program that simply reached its sunset clause. No one calls it a loss. No one calls it a victory. The language is neutral enough to survive congressional records, and heavy enough to bury responsibility. In the years that follow, something more durable than policy begins to settle. Inside intelligence agencies, Vietnam becomes a reference point, but a selective one. Analysts cite it as a warning against underestimating irregular warfare, against cultural blindness, against optimism bias. But rarely do they confront the deeper issue. The problem was not that the estimate was wrong. The problem was that it became untouchable. Once embedded in planning, budgets, troop deployments, and political messaging, correcting it would have required dismantling the entire logic of the war. And systems are designed to defend their logic, especially when lives have already been spent validating it. So the estimate was not corrected, it was outgrown. and by the time reality caught up, there was no clean way out. The final shock comes later. Years later, when the same patterns appear again. Different regions, different enemies, different technologies, but the same structure. Early assessments harden into assumptions. Contradictory data is treated as anomaly. Success is measured by metrics that confirm belief. Failure is reframed as persistence. Vietnam stops being an exception. It becomes a template, not because leaders learned nothing, but because institutions learned how to survive being wrong. And survival is not the same as understanding. Vietnam is remembered through images. Helicopters, protests, jungles, names etched in stone. But its most decisive moment did not happen in the field. It happened earlier, when prediction was mistaken for certainty, and certainty was allowed to replace adaptability. The enemy did not win because it was underestimated. It won because the estimate denying its endurance became too important to challenge. That is the quiet danger modern wars inherit. Not bad intelligence, but intelligence that becomes identity. Because once a war is built on being right, admitting error becomes more threatening than the enemy.